Recording in progress.
My name is Caitlyn Waraksa. Today is April 8th, 2024. The time is 2:45 p.m. We're at the Pewaukee VFW Post 9537 in Pewaukee, Wisconsin. I'm interviewing Chris Carillo, who was born on January 7th, 1977 in Ottawa, Illinois, and served during Operation Joint Endeavor in the post-9/11 period between 1995 and 2003. Chris Carillo was a staff sergeant in the United States Army and served as a military policeman. This interview is sponsored by the Bell Tower Memorial. What were you doing before you entered the service?
I was in high school. I was just like you, although a year older. I waited until my senior year. I was an athlete, and I was in a situation where I really needed help. I knew I wanted to go to college, and I needed a way to pay for it. So I kind of wanted to do it, or wait to see if I was offered scholarship money through sports. But honestly, I think even if I had, in hindsight, I think I still would have enlisted. Just because I had a desire to serve.
Okay, so you always had a thought that you
Always.
wanted to serve?
Always, yeah.
Did you have family members in the military?
Oh, I am a poster child for a variety of different ways my family's served our country. So I come from a family of vets. Every single one of my grandparents served. My grandmother was in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps in World War II. My grandfather was, when he retired, he was a master sergeant, having served in World War II and Korea. On the other side, my grandfather was in the Army, U.S. Army Air Corps in the South Pacific, was a tail gunner with the B-17s. And my other grandmother was actually a physicist and worked on the Manhattan Project.
Very cool. So did any of them have an influence in your decision to enlist?
Absolutely. My parents were also Marines. I don't want to exclude them. And I think when I wanted to serve, I talked to my mom, and she said, well, that's interesting, Chris, if that's something that you want to do. I talked to my dad, and he really said, it's a commitment, son. And when I talked to my grandfather about it, he said, why would you want to join the Army, Chris? You should really join the Air Force. So they all had a bite at the apple. They were all very influential in the very best of ways.
All right, so you went to basic training. Where did you go for that?
Lovely Fort Knox, Kentucky. In the summertime, where, at least in my day, they did not have air-conditioned barracks. It was the old World War II barracks, and they were warm, and I have very fond memories of Fort Knox, Kentucky.
Tell me about your early weeks of training and how you adapted to your military life.
I think based on the response from my two sons who have both been through basic now, and my own experience, I think it's good to have affirmation that first night or two when you're laying in the bunk and you're saying to yourself, what did I get myself into? Is this really what I wanted to do? The realization that you're in a new environment starts to sink in. The fact that you're spoken to directly, that you have military discipline instilled on you, that you're held to a higher level, higher standard of discipline, unlike anything that you've ever experienced before. And you really start to ingrain this sense of you find success and you fail as a team. They start to work that in almost instantly. And I had a really, it's funny because you look back at it and you say, it's the most fun that I never want to have again.
Yeah. So what was the food and living environment like there?
Living environment, we lived in a big bay. There were 50 of us or so that lived in there. That was my platoon. So when the Army is basic elements, you have 4 squads within a platoon, 4 platoons typically within a company, typically 4 companies within a battalion, so on and so forth. So we had 50 people in our platoon, and I still remember 2nd of the 46th Infantry basic training at Fort Knox, Kentucky, or as we would say, Bravo 246. And it was very hot. It was July and August, again in Kentucky, lots of humidity, and drill sergeants took advantage of that heat to really make sure you knew where you were. They would sometimes say we needed to cool down, and they had a sand pit in the back and would sometimes wake us up at 3 in the morning to make us crawl through the sand and spray water on you and get you really dirty enough so that you can fall back asleep for an hour and get back up and start your day. So they like to have fun with you. But the food was actually decent if you had the time to taste it. Many times they'd force you in, eat really quick, and then get out. They affectionately called it Big Spoon Day. Big Spoon because when you went through the line, you got your tray and everything else, you were given a big spoon as so that you could eat even more quicker. And so we had all kinds of fun that way. And strategically, when you walked into the mess hall every day, the tables were back. You always had to walk past a table full of drill sergeants staring you down. And you were nervous every time you walked past them because you knew they were going to find something. The way you were walking, the way you were holding your head, just to mess with you. And that's basic training life, just to keep you on your toes to make sure that you're really locked in.
How long were you there?
I think the Army says their basic training is 8 weeks and change. You actually are there longer because you go there and you in process. So when you show up, they issue you all your clothes, give you all your vaccinations and inoculations, make sure your pay and all the administrative work is good. And if you get there and it happens to fall within a weekend, you're going to be there longer because you stay through. And so I think when it was all said and done, I was in Fort Knox probably close to 9.5 weeks, maybe 10.
All right. What was your favorite memory from there?
I think the guys. When I went through basic training was still just men only within my company. I know that's changed, but I think the personalities, my drill sergeants were real characters. I kind of liked them actually. One of them was from Chicago. I grew up in the Chicago area, and he called me into his office, I remember. He said, well, you're from Chicago? Okay, well, I kind of like you. Yeah, he kind of liked me. Yeah, and they have funny ways of showing it, but I think the personalities, the people. And looking back at it now, drill sergeants were just professionals trying to get you through the other side and train you appropriately.
Yeah. What was your first assignment out of basic training, and what were your duties?
So I was a basic patrolman in Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, tiny little post in northern New Jersey. It's not even a post anymore. It's not even a base anymore. But at the time, it was the home of the West Point Prep Academy. There was an FBI listening post, and I think there was a communication school there for the Army. And it was beautiful. I was only there a short while, I think maybe 9 months. And I think I was there backfilling some people who'd been deployed. So I really enjoyed it. I wish I could have stayed longer, but that's the Army way of life.
When you had time off, if you did, what did you do? Did you have any hobbies?
Even at a young age, I've always appreciated culture and seen what was going on around me. And so my entire time in the Army, I'm glad to say that I was an adventure seeker. Even sometimes when you're not supposed to go somewhere by yourself, I was generally that person. If I couldn't talk somebody into traveling with me, I would jump on a train or whatever I could to get someplace and go and just walk around in town and visit a location.
What were your next assignment locations?
They were all mostly in Europe. So when I left, I went to Kaiserslautern, Germany, or K-Town as we called it, a town west of Frankfurt. And that was a really neat place. It was an old German city with a really big American presence. I really enjoyed it because there you got to work with the German Polizei, or the German police. We were very busy on the weekends. We typically would team up with one Army MP, military police, and then one German Polizei to do patrols together. Sometimes we'd get paired up with the Air Force Security Forces, their police, because there was so much of a concentration between all that we would all work together. And I had a lot of fun with that. I got to learn a lot about, I think, just different cultures and their approach to law enforcement just through that experience.
Very cool. What was your favorite assignment and why?
I don't know if it segues into any of my deployments, but I think being sent downrange for the first time. Downrange is a phrase that you use if you're forward deployed in a combat area. You call it being sent downrange. My first time going downrange, you don't know what to expect, and you grow up watching movies, war movies. You're like, okay, is this going to be like everything that I saw? No, it's all pretty unique, I think. And I got into country in Croatia, and then went on into Bosnia. What I loved about it is the diversity of people. It was very much like if you close your eyes and you say, imagine a village like Transylvania without any of the dark Dracula overtones. At the time, that part of the world was very much like that. I mean, old cobblestone roads, very narrow, almost impossible to drive a Humvee through, and the people were just very warm and couldn't speak English.
What was it like experiencing all the different cultures around the world, and what was your favorite one to experience?
I love all people. I mean, really, almost all people. And I think some of the unique experience that I really had, for me, I grew up Catholic. I grew up Roman Catholic, and there's a significant part of that world that's very Roman Catholic, to the extent that that is the identifying part about their culture. And you walk, and as you drive into a city, they have a big shrine of Saint Mary, and it's adorned and it's beautiful, and you see people marching to it back and forth. You go into a neighboring town, and in that part of the world, it's very common to have these commingled groups. It'd be a predominantly Islamic city, and sometimes the nice people in those cities would come out and feed us if we were just stopped. They were very kind to us most of the time, and so I think my experience was just people's acceptance of and interest in Americans at the time. And the kids always wanted to eat these snacks out of your MREs. I always used to save my little bags of M&Ms because I knew the kids would be around and I'd hand them out. That was fun. Yeah.
You kind of touched on it, but how did your religion play a role in your military experience?
I think that when you're homesick, especially when you're homesick, or just in everyday, in your everyday life, in what you're asked to do. I mean, there are times, especially in that deployment, where you had to be around certain things that I don't think anybody would choose to be. You had to go in, for example, sometimes if you had the order to go in and sweep a village for weapons, there are people who did not want you into their home, understandably so. And if they had a weapon, they didn't want to give it up to you. And I think in my case, it was patience. I think if there's anything that I learned growing up, it's just to be patient so that His will be done through you. And I would just treat everybody respectfully, regardless of where they came from, or even if they were mad at me, I would take that as a sign to say I need to be even more patient because I put myself in this person's shoes and I can't say that I'd feel differently. So I think that, and just trying to be mindful of signs around me all the time. You could be in a really bad area where bad things happen and you sit back and you could see a beautiful landscape, sometimes a sun setting and a beautiful valley, and it was just gorgeous. Beauties everywhere, not just in Waukesha, Wisconsin, but everywhere.
Yeah. Tell me about 9/11 from your perspective and what you were doing on that day.
Yeah, so 9/11, I was still in the Army Reserves. I was working at a software company and developing MLS software. And I was driving and I was half paying attention to the radio, and I didn't understand why they were running things on the World Trade Center in the early 90s. There was a bombing in one of the basements, I think on the North Tower, and but it happened in the wintertime, and I remember thinking, well, that's odd that they're playing an old playback of a bombing in the World Trade Center. And I got into my office, and I kind of worked in a big cube area, and they had pulled up some televisions, and it was obvious what had happened, and I think everybody sat there in shock. And I remember I immediately called into my reserve unit, the 79th Military Police Company, and said, okay, I don't know what's going on, but I volunteer right away. I want to be the first one to go and do whatever we're going to do. And 4 days later, I was activated, and I was on active duty for the next 10 months.
So what kind of duties did you have during that period?
Yeah, we got to do fun stuff. During that period of time, what they did is they activated a lot of National Guard types, and they put a rifle in their hand, put them in the airport to make people feel better. The truth of the matter is there weren't any rounds in those rifles. They may have had a magazine in them, but if so, they were empty. I think it was more of a psychological impact if you're traveling to take a look at that to say, we got this. Military police, because we're law enforcement, some of us were deputized and actually went on planes. Some of us actually started working with immigration and INS to help do deportations of locals in the area. And we were spread all over. So we were spread all over the Midwest. But some of us were then sent to Minneapolis International. Minneapolis International, there's an air base attached to it, and at the time, they had moved all the area F-15 and F-16s to this base. And they did that so they could scramble them at any given point in time because we didn't know what we didn't know. And so security was really beefed up at that time in that area. And so we had this hodgepodge of a police department. It was an air base. They had a security force there for the Air Force. The Department of Defense has their own police force, and they were there. And we were really sent there to help augment that department. And so it was like a bad sitcom of different police departments working together. After a couple months, we all really gelled and had a good time working together. And that's it. So my personal experiences, really doing a lot of law enforcement on the base. I did to go fly in a couple planes. That was fun. And then some of us got sent to Guantanamo Bay for a few months.
Very cool. During all that, what do you consider to be your most important contribution?
There's a lot that I don't want to take credit for, because at the time it was an odd feeling in the country. I think my one takeaway, and I'm sure everybody that listens to this in this room, and if they ever watch this, is to say that I've never seen our country more united in a beautiful, meaningful way after September 11th. I think no matter what I was asked to do, no matter where I was, no matter how cold I was doing it or high, it doesn't matter. It's a proud thing to say that at a moment that your country is so unified that you were part of that unity. And I think that for me is probably the most proud moment of that time.
What was it like transitioning to civilian life after the military?
It wasn't that bad. I mean, there are aspects of it that I really miss. And I lead a company now, and so I get to take some of the best lessons that I learned in the military and apply them into the team and how we work together and congeal as a team and everything else. And so that part's all good. But when you're in the military, you tend to have motivated individuals around you. You don't always get that same level of motivation and commitment in the civilian world. And that's okay. You can't really expect it. A lot of people have a 9-to-5 mindset and completing a goal. I've never been able to adopt a 9-to-5 mindset. I commit myself to an ideal and then I do it. It doesn't matter if I have to do something on a Saturday night, I do it. So I think that's it. I think you have a good perspective of what can work and what doesn't. And I think when you do successfully transition out of the military role into a civilian role, I think you just have to realize that there's a big bad world out there. There's a big world out there, and not everybody thinks of it in a military format.
Mm-hmm. So you kind of mentioned this earlier, but tell me more about MLS Aligned.
So that's an offshoot of a company that we're a part of, but in a broader sense, the multiple listing service is a technology and service company that provides property information to realtors and subsequently to buyers and sellers. So popular home sites like Realtor.com, Homes.com, Realtor.com, they don't procure that data. There are MLSs around the country that collect that data, and that's part of what we do. And we have realtors that work with us that provide information, but essentially we're just a big network and information provider. A lot of boring stuff that really excites me that probably puts most people to sleep.
Very cool. Are you still in contact with any of your military friends?
I am. Actually, preparing for this, I went through so many boxes trying to find. There's this one really cool picture of me. Something that I have some really cool pictures of my dad in Vietnam, where he's holding like an M16, or I guess at the time it would have been maybe an M14 in his arm. He's got like no shirt on, he's got an arm out like this, and he looks just ripped, and he's like, yeah, I'm really cool. The closest thing that I got to it was like, we'd call it, when you're in full battle, protectorate gear, so you have maybe a second chance vest, you have a flak jacket, you have your hard helmet called your Kevlar, you have other stuff around you. As an MP, we always had other stuff on us. We have cuffs and spray and everything else. I have this really cool picture of me standing in front of our command in Bosnia was in a city called Tuzla. It was called Eagle Base. That is something really cool about the Army. I don't know about the other branches, but the Army has really cool names for its bases. Like, we're in Eagle Base. Okay, that sounds pretty neat. I'm an Eagle base. And it had this really cool sign, and I'm standing in front of it. But then where I used to go all the time, because that's really a lot of what MPs do in combat, is they make sure that people traveling from one point to another are safe, essentially. And so we used to go through places like Steel Castle. I mean, as like a young guy, if I got to say I'm going to Steel Castle, I would write home to my mom. Mom, I went and visited Steel Castle today. Pretty cool. The names are inspiring. So, yeah, I think that.
Did you have a "this is all worth it" moment? If so, when?
Absolutely. I never questioned it. Like I said, that first couple nights, you check yourself mentally and say, my goodness, why is this man yelling at me? But I think where it really sets home is the first time that you're perhaps not at home, when it's Christmas or Thanksgiving. But what's really great about those moments is that you miss home, and actually, in a very silver lining kind of way, it makes you think to what made your upbringing so special. You have memories back of when you may have been with your uncle or your grandpa or your mom or your dad. But even if you're sad, you're surrounded by everybody who's going through the same thing that you are. And the one thing I have heard about the military from everybody that I've ever been around, and including my own experiences, nobody lets you be sad for a really long time. You go through things together. You experience highs and lows. And in that time, and actually, I have a really great picture. I'll show it right here. It's a silly picture. This is a little Christmas tree. This is my first time that I was home alone, that I was not home on Christmas. Here's what we have here. This box is what it was sent in from my mom. This is a little tiny Christmas tree. She wanted to make sure that my guys and I had a Christmas tree on Christmas. This big monstrous thing was a Euro power converter. You see, we pull everything to 110 amps. Everything in Europe is 220. So in order to plug anything in, you needed these big boxes to convert it in. And so this little insignificant tree meant the world to probably 10 of us, where we plugged it in and we all sat around it. And we probably stared for probably 20 minutes and didn't say a word to each other, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
So little things like this mean a lot.
Yeah. How often did you get to contact your family?
The world didn't communicate the same way in the 90s. I mean, these phones, I can call anybody in the world right now because I can use data to make phone calls now, right? Back then, you had to write letters. So the old school snail mail approach, right? You would do that. You could call on a payphone, and I think there were 3 payphones in the area that I was at. Multiply that by thousands of soldiers. It's sometimes difficult to get in there. We had these old military phones that what you could actually do, they're on a military network called DFS, and what you could actually do is hit a number for a military operator who could transfer you to the closest military base to your home, and what they could actually do is then transfer that to a phone number. The problem is you got cut off half of the time. So there were a few times I was able to speak to my mom, for example. Mom, I'm here, and Chris, you sound so far away. Yeah, it's this phone, Mom, that's how it works, whatever. And so that was really it. I mean, technically there was the internet, but it certainly wasn't in full use for consumers for us to use. So snail mail, phone calls, postcards were kind of nice. Anytime I would go, I'd send my mom a postcard from someplace interesting. Yeah, that's really it.
Did you have siblings to communicate with too?
I did. I have a brother and a sister. My brother followed me. He actually stayed in. He went into the Army. He was military police. As a side note, my mom and dad, they weren't just both Marines. They were both retired civilian police officers. So it was kind of beat into our head as kind of a culture, like this is our approach. And so it translated well with my brother and I suppose. But my brother, I would write him sometimes. My sister was kind of aloof. She cared about me, but she wasn't really involved. So I'd write to my brother. We're pretty close about it. And I came home on leave once, and he really loved the stories, and we'd giggle and talk about Rambo movies and stuff. And
Yeah. So what was your biggest life lesson you learned during military service that you couldn't get anywhere else?
Being miserable is a mindset. If you wake up and you're having a bad day, or if you think that you have to go walking through this area and it's going to be mud and you're going to be miserable and you're going to be cold, then you've adopted a poor mindset. I mean, truly, one of the most positive things about the military for me is adopting a mindset of positivity. Yeah, you can make an excuse to be miserable at any given point in time. But if you're like, yeah, it's going to be cold and it's going to be wet, I'm going to have fun with this. There's all manner of things that I would do to not be miserable. So for example, one time it was cold and rainy and we had to work in it. And this is before I was a sergeant, so I didn't have to be responsible. But I communicated with my sergeant and I said, hey, it's going to be terrible today, the weather. I said, would you be upset if at the end we go into that mud and we wrestle? Okay, and he didn't care. So there was a group of us who all wrestled in high school. Well, guess what? We went and got really dirty, and I'm just going to say that I dominated in the mud pit. So I was the king when we did it, and you do little things like that that are actually kind of fun. I wouldn't want to do it now, but it was fun in the moment.
Yeah. So what do you think your greatest achievement was?
I think keeping the fire going. I'm really proud of. I'm proud of my service, but I think bigger than that, it's a lineage. If you think of families as threads, this is my own metaphor. I can think back to my family's commitment to service for generations going back. I'm a piece of that thread. I can say, oh, I did this, and I went to airborne school, and I jumped out of planes, and I did these fun things. That's all fine and well, but I did it in such a way that I was honest, and I talked about the importance of commitment to my own sons, that I get a little emotional thinking about it, but now I have two sons who carry that fire forward, one who is just a phenomenal young man in the United States Air Force Academy, and the other one is at the Department of Defense Firefighting Academy at Goodfellow Air Base in Texas. That's what I'm probably the most proud of, is the fact that I now am part of that chain, and I will see that they will be part of that chain too. Makes me really proud of both of those guys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you had to tell somebody like debating whether to enlist or not, what would you tell them?
Well, first, I don't want to say that the military is for you. It's not for everybody. Mm-hmm. There are some people who just don't want to do it. My daughter would never want to touch the military, and that's okay. That's really okay. People can be veterans or veteran-minded and have a commitment to service in a matter of ways. I think teachers are phenomenal contributors to society. I think if you're somebody who wants to go directly into firefighting or law enforcement, tremendous way to serve your country that way. There are some who say, I want to raise my hand and either take the oath of enlistment, or perhaps they want to go on and become an officer. I would sit down with that person and say, what do you want? What do you want to accomplish? What experience are you looking for? And what's going on in your life? I don't think that military service is a bad thing for anybody that's curious, though. I mean, truly, if you can physically qualify and you have the mental capability to not break down if you're yelled at, which that can be learned. That can be learned too. You can learn how to toughen up a little bit from an exterior. That there's a reason why many countries still have this active conscription, that is mandatory service, right? It happens in areas that need it the most. I mean, look at Israel. If you're you're joining the IDF when you hit a certain age, and you're serving for, I think, 2 years. And I'm not suggesting that we should go to conscription or draft or anything, but what I'm saying is it's a great way for anybody to grow. Mm-hmm. And I think to give back to so much that we've been given.
Mm-hmm. If you could have gone, or if you could go back or do it over again, would you choose the same branch or the same role, or would you like to try something else?
That's a tough one to say. A redo or something, because I loved my time in the Army. I really did. But I think I would go Air Force. I served so much with those guys that I think, and those gals too, don't get me wrong. I served so much with the Air Force that I appreciate their approach to quality of life for their airmen. And Army took good care of me, but Air Force is pretty neat. They get to do a bunch of interesting things. Or the Coast Guard. I think the Coast Guard's interesting. It's really interesting depending on what you want to do. I mean, Coast Guard has a pretty broad law enforcement sense of purpose in what they do. So I think the Coast Guard's pretty neat.
Very cool. In closing, this has been an interview of Chris Carillo regarding his service during Operation Joint Endeavor in the post 9/11 period. My name is Caitlyn Waraksa. The time is 3:13 p.m.
So before we sign off, I just want to do this. As we do in the military, if you do something really good in front of a commander or a first sergeant or a sergeant major, what they actually do is they'll present you with what's called a challenge coin. Challenge coin is something that as a service member, you accumulate them if you do it right through your time in. And so leading today, I have a coin from the 437th Military Police Battalion that I served under when I was an E6 Staff Sergeant. And so, here, this is what it is. It's two sides. It's here, there. And so I thought to remember this and to keep this, I wanted to present you with this old challenge coin of mine. And I hope that you always hold on to it and you have fond memories of this interview.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for agreeing to this interview, and most importantly, thank you for your service.
Thank you.